career when we were trying to really make sense out of the chemical data sets and flow data sets that are so vital to any kind of water resources assessments. And then 25 years ago, I was working as chief hydrologist, and we were getting the National Water Quality Assessment Program off the ground, of which biological assessments are a major part. I kind of follow up on some thoughts things I heard from Terry about making monitoring data easy for managers to understand, and that's kind of the theme of what I'm going to talk about here. And then Dave's comment about the importance of long-term monitoring. And if you come away with nothing else from me, it's the importance of long-term monitoring. And I want to just emphasize what I think of as kind of three major reasons why it's important to do trend analysis, to look back in time to understand how our resources are changing. One of them is to track progress towards goals, and I've been working for the last 10 years very closely with the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Initiative, and there's a great interest in understanding, are they moving in the right direction in terms of the inputs to Chesapeake Bay and trying to reduce the nutrient loadings. Improving estimates of future conditions, because the future is predicated on a set of models, and the only way we can verify that those models are representing the way the system works at all reasonably is by having the data to make the comparisons. And then I think very important is the identification of surprises, and we've seen a number of them in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, things that we really didn't anticipate at all came out because of the collection of long-term data sets and the analysis of it to try to understand it. I do a lot of preaching in a talk like this, and I'll start with the person who's responsible for probably the most important long-term environmental data set in the world, and that's Dave Keeling, who started the Mauna Loa Observatory for CO2, and his son, Ralph Keeling, wrote a little piece in Science magazine about his father's work. And I love this quote, and I particularly use it with a lot of colleagues who are very, very enamored of what models can do for us in terms of trying to understand change. Ralph Keeling said, the only way to figure out what is happening to our planet is to measure it. And this means tracking changes decade after decade. And I often find people who want to know answers about change, and they want to know it's time frames like 5 years. And my reaction is, you're not going to learn about change in a short period. You have to stick with it decade after decade. And then the final part of that is poring over the records, which means having the tools and the time and the intellectual curiosity to look at the records and try to ferret out the things that reside in that data, which may not be obvious at first. Another quote I like to use is this one: models without data are fantasy, but data without models are chaos. This happens to come from atmospheric sciences, but I'll use it here in this is a wonderful data set that I was recently made aware of. It's a total mercury data set from the Sacramento River at Freeport, collected by Regional Sand and provided to us. And what we can see in this record is the fact that there's a long-term trend. So this is concentration on a log scale versus time over a more than 20-year period. And it's obvious that there's a downward trend in the total mercury, but there's still a huge amount of variability. What's going on in this kind of data set? And I want to talk to you about strategies for looking at these kinds of things. So there's the data set that I just showed you, concentration versus time. The next piece of this graph is that same concentration data here plotted against discharge. And in the last talk, Dave talked a lot about the importance of high flow events and how much things can change as a function of flow. And here we see for the mercury data, because so much of it almost entirely is particulate related, we certainly see much higher concentrations at higher flows than we do at lower flows, but still there's a tremendous amount of inherent variability there. And then finally we can look at it against the season of the year, and here's a set of box plots of those concentrations versus months. So we have a lot of things going on. And in order to deal with these kind of data sets, about 10 years ago, I developed with colleagues of mine at the USGS something called weighted regression on time, discharge, and season, a way of unpacking these sources of variability so that we can really begin to understand what's going on and summarize the changes that are occurring over time. We first published the methodology in 2010. It's in regular use in the Chesapeake Bay watershed and nationally in the USGS National Water Quality Assessment Program. And it's designed to be a type of exploratory data analysis to help people understand what's really happening. And it was designed to have a set of characteristics that really broke it apart as different from a lot of existing statistical approaches to looking at long-term data. It's both exploratory and quantitative, so we can learn visually what's going on. And by the way, I just want to put in a plug for Marcus Beck, who's speaking this afternoon. Marcus has taken the methodology that I'm describing here for flowing streams and applied it to estuarine situations, and has already published a very nice paper. He's worked on Tampa Bay, Chesapeake Bay, and now San Francisco Bay using the estuarine equivalent of this methodology. So it explores the concentration versus discharge relationship, and it recognizes that the nature of those relationships can change over time as sources change and processes change in the system, rather than putting these relationships into a mathematical straitjacket. It recognizes that seasonal patterns can change over time. It recognizes that the temporal pattern of the trend can take on any shape, including non-monotonic. I've been working a lot on the issues of Lake Erie and the toxic algal blooms occurring there. And what's clear is that they had several decades of major improvement, and then in the last decade or so, tremendous deterioration. And a lot of statistical methodologies that are designed to look at water quality trends really make a fundamental assumption that trends are monotonic and make it very difficult to really accurately describe the kinds of things that are going on. It analyzes both for concentration trends and for flux trends, and getting people to think about what is it I'm interested in. Am I interested in the concentration of what's in the water as it affects the organisms as it goes by, or am I interested in the flux, that is to say, what is delivered to a downstream estuary, reservoir, lake, or whatever it might be. And the answers to questions about water quality change over time can be very different depending on whether you take a concentration perspective or a flux perspective. It makes estimates of actual history as well as flow normalized history. The idea here is that it's one thing to know what happened, to try to estimate what happened day by day over the particular record that you have, but it's also important to know how the system behavior is changing and to be able to look past these big variations that occur because of wet and dry years and get at underlying behavioral change. Really increase the signal to noise ratio that we have in our data set so we can get at the underlying change. It handles censored data, the less thans, which are so prominent, particularly in metals time series. It handles the non-stationarity of discharge. Discharge is such an important driver of so many water quality and biological processes, and we know that discharge is changing dramatically in some cases because of climate change as well as land use and water use change. We need a method that recognizes that discharge is gradually changing over a period of multiple decades. This method can be used to look at exceedances of thresholds, biological criteria, etc. We use this in a study of chloride trends in streams in snow-affected areas, urban areas of the United States. And it reports on the uncertainty of estimates. So let's just get into it, and I'll just mention, if you're interested, this methodology is entirely implemented within in our package called Egret, and a related one called Egret CI, which has to do with the uncertainty estimates, and those are available on PRAN. And Egret stands for Exploration and Graphics for River Trends. And it's more than just this one statistical methodology. It's a way of looking at riverine data, both flow and chemistry data, that helps you really grasp what's going on by looking at it from a lot of different dimensions. So I won't get into the mathematics of how WRTDS works, except to say that what it does is look at this entire data set, and in this particular case, there's about 200 observations over about 20 years, and it uses statistical smoothing concepts to estimate the expected value of concentration as a function of discharge, and it does so for any given date. So it's taking into consideration, and this is just an arbitrary example, this says for 1996, January 15th, on that particular date, what do we think is the relationship between discharge, which is plotted on the x-axis, and concentration, which is plotted on a log scale on the vertical axis for total mercury at the Sacramento River, and uses smoothing that considers nearness in time and season and in discharge to estimate a smooth function that we believe is a reasonable representation of the variations in concentration in this system at that particular point in history. We can then do it again for yet another point in history. This is January 15th of 2014, and that's indicated by the red line. And what we can see there is that low discharges, in this case 5,000 cubic feet, 5,000 cubic feet per second, the red line indicates expected value about 1, whereas 20 years prior, the expected value was about 3 or 4 nanograms per liter, and yet at high flows they didn't differ very much, and it has a lot to do with basically the placer mining deposits really becoming less and less mobile and available in the system, but when you have a really high flow event, you still get these large quantities, but at moderate to lower flows, those are going down. So we can take this kind of approach of developing our representation of how the system behaves on at any given time, and we can create sort of a complete visualization of how we believe this system has changed over time. So on the x-axis is time over a 20-year period. On the y-axis is discharge. The two graphs that I just showed you are represented by the black arrow on the left, the red arrow on the right. Those vertical lines represent those relationships. But it's basically saying, and some would argue it's a counterfactual representation of how the system behaves, and it just simply says, if this value was observed, of discharge had been observed on a particular date in history, what do we think the concentration would have been on that date? And the colors represent the expected value of concentration for that combination of discharge, year, and time of year in nanograms per liter. But we can then take that kind of representation and essentially try to create a representation of the expected value of concentration on the days during that entire record, and this is a piece of that concentration estimate record from 1996 to 2000. We can also translate that into a record of flux. Again, it's depending on whether we're concerned about an organism or a drinking water intake that may be close to that site versus a concern for the downstream receiving water body. This is the flux record that we would create from that model, that contour plot that you saw. And you can see, of course, it's much more peaked because it's representing flux, which is a multiplying concentration times discharge. And we can integrate over that, and we can come up with a record of what we think the average concentration would have been in any given year. And that's what this record, this is what it shows, and of course it shows the high flow years is sticking up as higher average concentration years. We can also compute a flux history, which looks a lot like it, except those high flow years are even more extreme in the degree to which they depart. And this is where we get into something that I think is often a problem in people working on improving water quality in a particular area, and I call it this problem of starting with the thrill of victory, which is that somebody looks at a time series of decreasing concentrations or decreasing flux, in this particular case about a 4-year period, where these were going down, and they say, I think maybe we're having success if there's some kind of a control strategy for this. And then, of course, things turn around and we have a series of high flow years, and we have the agony of defeat. And the real question is, how is the underlying properties of the system changing, and how's the behavior changing? And if this kind of high flow event had occurred sometime in the past, what would we have seen from it? And the next part of this is really a way of kind of getting at that problem. So we need to remove the influence of year-to-year variation in discharge, but not the influence of seasonal variation and not the long-term trend that may exist in discharge. And we call this technique flow normalization. And so we have a fair amount of complexity in the methodology that I'm laying out here. We have different products for different purposes. We're interested in concentration, as I mentioned before, and we're interested in flux, and we need to be able to calculate both. We also have this actual history of what we think, what's our best estimate of what happened in any given year or any given month, but we also want a flow normalized history that removes that interannual variation that's due to extreme high or extreme low or average year conditions. And a series of cartoons attempts to kind of get at that, where you have a watershed, it doesn't matter where, this just a watershed flowing into an estuary, which could just as well be a lake or a reservoir. And if someone is an ecologist looking at how is this system responding to stresses, they want the actual flux history. They want to know how much of this substance of interest, in this case mercury, but it could be nutrients or what have you, how much of it flowed in a particular year. But if the question is, how are we doing in a control strategy up in the watershed, we really want to remove that year-to-year variation and get at how we're doing